All right, so we have news out of the Middle East. So early this morning, Reuters broke the response from Hamas to the earlier deal that had been proposed, by Israel through Qatar. Initial reports had come out that Hamas had rejected the Israeli proposal for a whatever you want to call it, ceasefire, humanitarian pause. In fact, they came back with this proposal, which we can lay out in detail here and talk about this. So they propose 3 45-day ceasefires rolling in phases. So the first phase would see all Israeli women hostages, men and boys under 19, the elderly and the sick would be exchanged for Palestinian women and children held in Israeli jails. During that time, Israeli troops would withdraw from Gaza, and the reconstruction of hospitals and some refugee camps would begin. So then the second 45-day phase would see the remaining Israeli hostages exchanged for some amount of Palestinian prisoners. We don't know how many at this point that Hamas is demanding. There have been some maximal demands from some in Hamas saying every single person in Israeli captivity at this point, in Israeli detention. That is something that obviously Israel is going to push back on and
non-starter,
and can make an offer of fewer people. Say, we're keeping these folks. You can have these folks back. The third and final 45-day phase would see the exchange of the remains of those who have died on both sides, and it would then end with a permanent ceasefire. This is the deal, and actually we'll roll. When President Biden addressed the nation yesterday afternoon, he had already gone over this proposal, though it had not leaked to the press. Here's how Biden responded to it.
There is some movement, and I don't want to, well, maybe choose my words. There's some movement. There's been a response from there's been a response from the opposition, but yes, I'm sorry, from Hamas, but it seems to be a little over the top. We're not sure where it is. There's a continuing negotiation right now.
He's the person that is allegedly negotiating this deal, Ryan, and he cannot get through a sentence in under 30 seconds. An easy sentence. He needs somebody in the audience. I don't know if people caught that, if they were just listening, to yell out Hamas when he was looking for the word Hamas because he was bumbling and stumbling around to find it.
No, nobody would mistake me for like the most fluid speaker. But come on, man.
Well, it's a little different, right?
But come on, I'm also not president of the United States.
That's true.
He did seem to forget the name of Hamas.
Yeah.
Am I overreading that there?
No, it's genuinely painful to watch, and then it's painful on his behalf. I mean, I think that's the human reaction when you hear that or watch that. It's painful on his behalf, but then you have to remind yourself, oh, this is the president of the United States who is the person at the negotiating table, the commander-in-chief of the military. If I'm a member of the military and I'm watching that, it's terrifying to me. If I'm a member of the military's family, that's terrifying to me. It's just painful all around.
Imagine how terrifying it must be for him, too. He's up at the podium, and he's about to describe the counteroffer from Hamas, and he can't find the word Hamas.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
I would imagine his brain's just like going bananas at that point.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And he's like, the opposition. And then somebody's like, Hamas. He's like, yeah, Hamas. So before we get to KGP's response to this, the underlying kind of inability of the two sides to get to a deal so far is pretty fundamental. So yesterday, the Jerusalem Post had a sentence in one of its articles that I wanted to read because I think it really gets at the divide here. They wrote, "At issue between Hamas and Israel is the terror group's insistence that a deal must include an end to the Gaza war, while Israel has stood on its principled position that it must be allowed to complete its military campaign to oust Hamas from the enclave." So on the one hand, you have one party that wants to end the war. You have the other party that wants to end the other party.
Yeah.
You can imagine how that's going to be difficult to get to a place at the end where you reach a deal. Like, where's the common ground between those two positions?
Right, and I mean, it's interesting. The phrasing of the sentence is interesting, as you're pointing out, and also, I mean, it's tough because from the perspective of people who might be reading the Jerusalem Post, they would look back and say, well, there were people who were calling for a ceasefire on October 8th, October 9th, October 10th, or, immediately saying, preemptively, in fact, saying, like, October 8th, ceasefire, this is going to be bloody and devastating. And so before it even starts, ceasefire. And so I understand that position that, there had to be some type of response, but it's getting harder and harder, to your point, to say that the response has, or to persuade the public that the ongoing response is within the realm of proportionality or is within the realm of reasonableness when you have so many people dead and you have Hamas going back into northern Gaza. You have the military mission of, quote, eradicating Hamas looking less and less likely every single day. And when you still have 136 hostages, a report yesterday from the Israeli government is that they had notified more than 30 family members of the remaining 136 hostages that their loved one passed away. They said most of those were likely on October 7th. It's hard to say, but this is making it very difficult. To your point, it makes Israel's position increasingly untenable. Yeah.
And from the Hamas side, you've had senior Hamas officials who have given interviews saying, we're only recognizing the state of Israel as a ruse, as a temporary ruse, and ultimately we think the entire land is occupied and we'd like to take it back. So in that sense, both parties in the negotiation want the elimination of the other party. What they actually want matters less than what they can actually do. And Hamas doesn't really have the capacity to eliminate a nuclear power.
Right, they're both in the one-party state train. But to your point, yes, yeah.
And elements of them both pretend that they support a two-state solution.
Right.
But not necessarily the leading elements at this point. But it does put Hamas in this weird position of being the one for a ceasefire, and Israel being the one for for continuing the war, and it puts the United States in the awkward position of saying no, we want the war to continue. And so here's how Karine Jean-Pierre at the White House yesterday kind of squared that circle.
Separate topic, on the hostage negotiations, our team who's been covering this all in the Middle East says that Hamas is still insisting on a permanent ceasefire. Is it still this administration's position that it opposes a permanent ceasefire?
What we have been working towards, and you've heard us say over and over again, we want to see a humanitarian pause. We want to make sure that we get these American hostages home, and also hostages more broadly, obviously, home to their families. And we want to make sure that we get that critical aid, the critical aid that Palestinians need into Gaza. It is important to get that aid, whether it's medical, whether it's food. We have to get that in. And so we believe a humanitarian pause gets us there. There is, as I stated at the top, Hamas has responded to the framework of a hostage deal. And so we're going to review it. And I'm going to be really, really careful. I'm not going to dive into or telegraph information about their response from here. But we've been very clear that we believe that we need to get to another humanitarian pause because that humanitarian aid needs to get in. And also,
humanitarian pause. It is the administration's position that a permanent ceasefire.
We have been very clear. We've been very clear on where we stand on the ceasefire. That has not changed.
So the U.S. is doing a kind of dangerous dance here, where I don't know if you've seen some of this reporting, but effectively what the U.S. has been telegraphing is that through Qatar then over to Hamas saying, okay, this is what we're saying publicly, that we want these humanitarian pauses. Our official position is that we're not for a permanent ceasefire. But if you can get to an extended humanitarian pause, 90 days, 135 days, as in this Hamas proposal, then the U.S. will not allow Israel to relaunch the war.
Right.
In other words, cool it down, and it will stay cooled down.
Right.
Hamas has kind of pushed back with, how can we trust that? Like nothing that you've said, nothing that the U.S. has said to Israel so far has led to changes in Israeli behavior. So why would this? What do you make of that kind of this yawning gap between the public and private positions of the Biden administration.
I mean, I think it's for one of the difficult things in negotiating here is that it's immensely difficult for either side to trust that the other side will execute on what they're promising to execute on, especially with the volatile context of the entire Middle East right now, where something can change in an instant. I mean, it's very easy to imagine another situation like what happened just a couple of weeks ago to the United States in Jordan, where 3 reservists were killed, completely changing the dynamics of what was negotiated and agreed on. I don't know, what do you make of the idea that if there is an extended pause, that there will be an ability to sort of prevent the war from relaunching?
It's interesting. It's plausible, and it's plausible in a sense that you could imagine that once the momentum goes towards reconstruction and aid coming back in, that you could imagine how that can take hold and last. On the other hand, the context here is that Netanyahu is extraordinarily unpopular. He knows that if he faces a snap election, he's probably going to get ousted. And he's facing corruption charges, which means that if he gets ousted, those charges slap back in, and he might wind up actually getting convicted of something. And so Netanyahu is the ultimate political survivor. And so he also is no fan of Biden. So if we're talking 4 months from now, we're in the summer. And so you can also see the domestic U.S. politics where if Netanyahu restarted the war in the summer or fall, that's probably pretty damaging for Biden because he will have looked as though he failed in his diplomatic effort to get this war to an end. And then Netanyahu might think, well, now I've got Trump, and I can roll the dice with Trump coming in a couple of months. And so that, Trump is a classic live to fight another day politician. Like just, people are always looking for his long-term strategy when he doesn't really usually have one. It's just like his business strategy, just trying to stay, one day ahead of the creditors. And in his political strategy is the same, staying one day ahead of all of his opponents. Netanyahu the same. So that's why you can imagine a world where it solidifies, but you can also see how Netanyahu would have the kind of incentives to make sure that it didn't.
And again, why there's no trust on either side of that negotiation at this point.
And and Hamas has criticized Israel for releasing Israeli detainees through the previous deal, and then days later raiding their houses in the West Bank and just bringing them right back in. Like, what? Hey, we kept up our part of the bargain. We released them. We didn't say we wouldn't pick them up, 3 days later. So you had mentioned that if we could jump to the final element of the block that you had just mentioned. This is a report from Ken Klippenstein over at The Intercept. You had mentioned the attack on the Jordanian base. I wanted to talk about this briefly because he said the headline here: American base in Jordan where drone killed through 3 U.S. troops, dogged by inadequate air defenses. I'd encourage people to read the whole story because based on sources who've served at this base, he really lays out how vulnerable this base was to this drone attack. The military explanation was that there was some confusion, that they had a drone out there, and they thought that this drone that was coming back to the base was an American drone. It actually turned out to be an Iraqi militia drone, and 3 reservists end up getting killed. That is a second question I'd love to have answered, by the way. Why are reservists overseas at this base? Like if we're not at actual war, people who are in the reserves should be at home. Like they should not be called. They shouldn't be called up. We should have enough troops with $1 trillion budget that we don't need to call up reservists and send them to Jordan. But then the other point, as you read through his story, you're like, we're putting all of these American troops in harm's way, and not giving them adequate protection, and spending billions of dollars on protecting the Israeli government, which then antagonizes and produces the conflict that then leads to our own troops getting killed without adequate protection.
And remember, Biden didn't know where, this is another thing that I'm surprised hasn't gone into play when people are talking about what happened in Jordan, is Biden didn't know where his Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was for how long?
Right.
I mean, in all seriousness.
She finally apologized for. And,
Lloyd
and
Austin.
the press is like, well, wouldn't everybody else be fired for this? He's like, yeah.
I mean, you can see, again, you can see why. You have two hot wars, one of which spiraled into 3 American deaths. I'm sure there are plenty, I don't know the exact number of remaining hostages that are American, but you can't, I mean, it's just insane the level of incompetence every single day coming out of the Biden administration. And this, if we put A3 up on the screen, this was some news yesterday. I just mentioned this, but Israel confirmed the deaths of 31 hostages as Hamas was responding to those proposals. That was a confidential internal Israeli review that the New York Times got its hands on. The Times adds, the fate of a further 20 people is also in question amid unconfirmed intelligence that they may also have died during their captivity. So that would bring the number of hostages somewhere around 100 living hostages. And, you know, lots of questions about who died and when will remain for Netanyahu for a very, very long time, Ryan.
Yes. And also, right, you're probably correct in reading the intelligence there that most of these probably died on October 7th. And their remains were taken back to Gaza. Also, Gaza, as we've all seen from news reports, has been an extraordinarily dangerous place for everybody. And the hostages who have been released have told Israeli media that the thing that they were most afraid of was the 24/7 bombing campaign, and that they were nervous that they were going to die under rubble from Israeli fire.
Right. They felt like the IDF didn't know where they were, was a quote that a couple of them gave after they were released.
Or we're hoping they didn't know where they were, because if they knew where they were and were still bombing that area, then I think that's even harder to absorb, that your government would willingly do that.
Well, and again, I think to the point you were making earlier, it's hard for Israel to maintain, especially when obviously the country is focused on the return of the hostages. It's harder for Israel to maintain its position that it must complete the military operation when hostages have died, frankly, during the military operation, when there have been hostages remaining for so long during the military operation, and when you have returned hostages saying that they didn't have, they didn't feel confident the military operation was not going to result in their deaths, that's a really difficult position.
Yeah. And the war itself continues to be extraordinarily dangerous also for IDF soldiers. The IDF has not confirmed this, but according to the Hamas Telegram channel, Al-Qassam Brigade's Telegram channel that posted this morning, 7 IDF soldiers were killed, quote, in the vicinity of Al-Hawaz near the Hayat school west of Khan Yunis. This is a Telegram channel that it's kind of the official channel that broadcasts Hamas military news, and often is confirmed later by either IDF or media reports. So it's a fairly reliable. Whether or not this is true, we'll find out in the next hours or maybe days. But 7 IDF soldiers killed in a single confrontation would be, one of the highest casualty rates in a day between Hamas and the IDF, and it comes just as these negotiations are getting to potentially a breakthrough place. And so it's just a reminder of how the world and everyone just needs this war to end.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.